I love hearing the sound of the cello during worship, and we're certainly blessed with the people we have here with their musical abilities. But you might notice that Julia only ever plays one song. And she shared with me that she's developed issues in her wrist because she's mainly self-taught, and she didn't have anybody to watch as they played, and so she developed some bad habits that led to issues in her wrist down the road. And I understand that last week, as we've gone through this series on, called The Struggle is Real, and going through challenges in life, and last week we talked about a bad example, Saul, who couldn't wait for Samuel to arrive. And yet for many of us, we have no shortage of bad examples to look at around us. I felt the same way, going into marriage, and no shortage of failed marriages around us. But what does it look like to do this well? What is a positive example that we can turn to? And so a verse in Romans chapter 15, verse 4 says this: "For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope." All of this, and at this point I'd be waving a Bible, except I have a tablet here, and so all of this, all of Scripture is intended to provide you, especially in those times, endurance and encouragement. And those examples, as we look to the Old Testament especially, and the saints who followed God faithfully, you look to that, and that sets you an example when you find yourself in a similar circumstance. And so today, I want you to listen to what God has to say in a familiar story, the story of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Sorry, you probably only know them by their slave names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Anybody who's been through children's church at any point in their life has almost certainly done like a felt board or cardboard cutout of these characters. Open your Bibles to the book of Daniel, chapter 1. The book of Daniel follows several young Hebrew men as they're taken as slaves when Israel is destroyed by the Babylonians. The king Nebuchadnezzar goes in and he loots the temple, and he goes back to his homeland bringing trophies. Some of them were articles taken from the holiest place in the temple that now he serves wine in as a declaration of his conquest. But he also takes back people as trophies. He looked out, in verse 4, he found youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So he takes the pick of all the young men of Israel, and he handpicks some of them and brings them back. And the message is this: I'm going to make you like us. For instance, and he renames them. He renames Azariah, which means Jehovah has helped, becomes Abednego, meaning servant of Nebo, a pagan god. And all of their names, they're changed to reflect pagan deities. They're saying, this is your new identity, and the new language that you're going to speak, and the new culture that you're going to learn. Now, these people, they have families. I imagine they had great plans for what their lives were going to look like. And they're the pick of the litter. They are the best, the cream of the crop. And so they had all of this future options available for them. And the army comes in, and all of that is taken away. And now they're being forced to learn the language and the history and the customs of their oppressors. And so we arrive at the purpose of the book of Daniel. And it was written to set an example for the Jews who were in exile. See, they weren't the only ones carried off. An entire generation of Jewish people, some of them were killed, some of them died in a famine, and others were carried off as captives to Babylon, where it would be 70 years before they could return to the land. And they began asking questions like, well, how do we live faithful to God in a land that doesn't even know Him? I mean, we're enduring the punishments for generations of our ancestors turning away from God, and now we're here and everything is horrible. What do we do? Sometimes I think that we suppose that our circumstances make godliness difficult. Because I hear people saying, if only, and then they fill in the blank as though some change in their circumstances would lead to greater faithfulness in their life. We say things like, oh, if only I didn't have to drive so far to work or behind such slow drivers, my attitude would be more godly. If only I didn't have to play eeny, meeny, miny, mo when I pick which bills to pay every month. You see, I would trust God more then. If only my kids listened or kept their hair out of the mixing bowl. You see, I would have more patience and would be a better parent. If only my spouse would chew quieter. Or whatever it is, that one thing they do that absolutely drives you nuts. Let me tell you what I do. I wait until Sarah is just about to fall asleep, and then my entire body convulses in a dream. Do this regularly. Say, if only they would make marriage easier, then I would be a more godly example of what God's called me to be. Understand that so much of the Bible is not written by people who are in ideal conditions. It's not written to people who are in ideal conditions. You understand that prison letters are an entire category of books of the Bible that should tell you something. In his first letter, Peter addresses those who are slaves with cruel masters. Now, their lives weren't difficult because of their righteousness. They hadn't done anything to put themselves in that situation either. It's just like this in-between. Life is just hard. And this is what he says to them. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. So he says, look, you didn't put yourself into this situation by anything you've done. It's just hard. And yet, God sees it. And he looks with favor on you when you endure this in a godly way, which is that you're mindful of God and that you endure it because of him. So when your boss chews you out for no reason, when you have a toxic family member that speaks evil of you, when you just wake up and you're sore for no reason whatsoever, there is value in godly suffering. Daniel and his friends responded to their situation in two ways. And the first way was they remained faithful to God. And if you can imagine what this looked like, total immersion in a pagan culture. And this reminds me of those who are trying to escape addiction. As I talk to these people week in, week out at Celebrate Recovery, and so many of them, they're like, I've been on meth all my life. I've been in and out of prison, and I've got no job prospects. All of my family are users. All of my friends are users. And there's no place I can go that puts me more than 5 minutes away from my next hit. And they feel that they are just totally immersed. How can I be faithful? God taught Daniel faithfulness in Babylon. Not by removing him from the evil empire, but by giving him the strength and the courage to endure in the middle of it. So Daniel, as he writes the book, he mentions the pagan name that they gave him. He refuses at any point in the book to refer to himself by his slave name, because that's not who he is. And then you have to understand, as a Jewish person, they're used to living in Israel under their own laws that God himself had given them. And how, as a Jew, can you adhere, for instance, to dietary laws when you're in a pagan country? It's like some of you, you're on a diet and you're heading into holiday season and you're going to go to relatives and in-laws' house and butter is in everything. How can I be faithful? Some of you in the marriage could come to our house and here is cupcakes on the table. And so Daniel goes and he approaches them as they put them into this program. So the idea is they take these young guys and we're going to train you and you're going to serve in the court. And as part of that, Daniel goes and he asks, hey, I don't want to defile myself with your food. Chapter 1, verse 8. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. He says, hey, just let me eat only vegetables and drink only water. And if I'm not healthy, you can take that away. Just let me do this so I don't defile myself. And note the hint of respect that he shows. Even though, again, these are evil conquerors making him a slave, he addresses them with gentleness and respect. And God honored this, and at the end of time, they're just as healthy as anybody else. But hear me, church. Please hear me. This is not a diet plan. Oh, that really aggravates me when you got, the Christian book industry, and they'll sell you anything. And they'll say, oh, the Daniel diet plan, if you eat only vegetables and drink only water. Yes, you will lose weight, but this is not a God-ordained diet. In fact, if anything, the Bible remarks that it's remarkable that they were healthy at the end of it. So the implication here is that vegans normally wouldn't be as healthy as other people, but God miraculously allowed them. But Daniel wasn't trying to lose some weight here. He was trying to be faithful to God. The second thing that they did was to apply themselves where they were. So they go into this training program along with other handpicked young men from other cultures that they had conquered. And they weren't just C students trying to avoid punishment. They weren't trying to figure out how to undermine the system from inside the system. At the end of the program, here's what's said about them. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood out before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all of his kingdom. They were in a situation they didn't want to be in, but they refused to allow themselves to succumb to the victim mindset. That is to dwell on the powerlessness of their situation. Because they could have spent all day complaining, but I didn't want this in my life, and I don't have any freedom at all, and I never hear my mother tongue being spoken anymore. These people worship idols, and yet I have to obey them. They didn't do that. They put their heads down, they applied themselves where they were. Let me tell you, much of my life has been defined by failures and mistakes that I made as a teenager. Some of you have faced lifelong consequences because of decisions you or somebody else made, and it feels like it casts a shadow over your whole life, and you wonder, when will I ever be out from under this? Will this follow me forever? Let me tell you, you decide what you're going to do where you are right now. And for some of us, it's time to stop dwelling on what happened to you, or what you did, or what somebody else did to you. It's time to figure out what you can do to be faithful to God where you're at right now. And I hit a point where I decided, if my future is working a shovel for the rest of my days, you know what? I'm going to be the best asphalt shoveler these guys have ever seen. And I became that guy that my boss, if he had some stupid menial task that nobody else would really do, I became that guy that got trusted with it. He just dropped me off with a sledgehammer and say, I want you to turn half that driveway into rubble. And he knew that if he came back, I would have done above and beyond what he asked me to do. And even now, if I have to substitute teach to help make ends meet, let me tell you, this Tuesday, I'm subbing for a 5th grade class. I'm going to be the best substitute teacher they've ever had.
True.
You can ask some of my students that I've taught.
True.
And that's what they did. They said, look, we didn't choose this for ourselves. But if we're going to be in a program, you know what? We're going to serve Nebuchadnezzar, who killed people we loved. We're going to serve him better than anybody else. And as a result of their performance, they get put into positions of power. And this earns them enemies. And these enemies saw their chance when King Nebuchadnezzar did what many kings did. He decided, patriotism is really too indirect. You need to be worshiping me directly. And so he builds this giant gold statue of himself. And he declares that everybody, when they play my theme song, must bow down before it or be burnt to death. And here's what happens. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. And so they point the finger at them and they say, they're not really trustworthy because you've brought them here, you've made them learn our language and our culture and our customs, but they're still not like us. They're not really loyal, you see, because they don't worship your gods. They probably speak Hebrew on their own time. They worship their own gods. They're secretly disloyal. And they can't be truly loyal to our nation and its rulers and its gods. And when you look throughout history, this kind of thing happens to Christians a lot. Where despots and dictators look at followers of Jesus and question their loyalty because what do we say? Jesus is Lord, not you. And so repeatedly this happened in the Roman Empire when, the act of patriotism everybody would do was you just got to burn some incense and hail Caesar as a god. And Christians would say, no, he's not Lord. Jesus is Lord. And so they were disloyal. And it happens today in China. Where the communist government there fears what it cannot control. And these home churches that develop that they can't tell them what to teach are a massive threat to the way things are. And so they distrust them. The gospel, hear me, will always be out of sync with every form of human government because it's all imperfect. And our greatest loyalties lie elsewhere. And hear me, even if it's not the government, your faith will lead to conflict. Again and again and again, we're given these examples in the Bible where people, because of their godliness, are targeted. And so you've got to understand that if you're faithfully living out the gospel, it's going to lead to some problems. When you're the guy working that shovel harder than everybody else, the people who are slacking off on their jobs, even if you never say a word to them of judgment, feel judged because of your example, and it highlights their own failings. So they go and they accuse the Jews to Nebuchadnezzar, and here's how he responds. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he's using their slave names now. You can tell the difference. Whenever the king is being addressed, their slave names are used. If he's not being addressed, their Hebrew names are used. And so they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered them and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I've set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" All of their hard work, all of their faithfulness in every other area that could be measured didn't matter to him if they were not willing to bow the knee like everybody else. And then he says, "Who can deliver you out of my hands?" He basically says, can you imagine anything in all creation more powerful than myself? Nebuchadnezzar was used to going in and conquering countries that had their own gods that they bowed down to, the god of this country and the god of that country, and he had conquered them all, and he had brought these people back as trophies. So how dare you think that your God can deliver you from me? You are my trophies, so bow. And he gives them another chance. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. I wish I could have been there to see both their bearing and reaction to this king, who I imagine is not used to being told the word no, and the reaction of the people around them. This is unheard of, that faced with certain death, they say, you know what? God is able to deliver us, and we believe he will. Even so, we will choose death before dishonor. And here's what Saul lacked. Remember last week we talked about Saul was waiting for Samuel to come and bring the blessing. And when it came down to it, he was not willing to risk, as he saw it, going into battle unprepared. And so he chose to disobey God before risking his own life. These men chose the opposite. If they were in Saul's place, they would have said something like, Samuel may not show up, but it would be better for us to die in battle than to disobey God. For people today, perhaps we should be saying something like, divorce is not a way out of the struggles of my marriage. Better to fight the hard fight than take the easy way out. Better to live poor than to lie about my income on my taxes. And I'll say for me, better that my house be destroyed and everything in it than to put my trust in things other than the God who provides all things. And you hear their attitude. They are more concerned for themselves. They are more concerned with a godly response than a miraculous deliverance. For them, the idea of whether or not God is going to save them from certain death is a footnote to what is really important to them, which is telling this king, no matter what happens, I'm not serving your gods. We serve the living and true God. Do we reflect that in our prayers? When we go into times of struggle so often, I'm speaking personally here, so often, my dominating thought is, God, take me out of this. God, preserve me from that. God, save me from this. It is not predominantly, God, in this, you can deliver, but God, please give me a heart that seeks you and honors you in this circumstance. God, let my words and my actions and everything that I am be faithful to you in this. Perhaps I've been praying for the wrong things. And here's what happens. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. The expression of his face was changed. I imagine that he went into this conversation thinking that they would bend under the pressure. Perhaps he put the whole, or die in a fire line as just, we're all going to do it, right? So nobody has to die in a fire. But his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And in fact, the guards who take them up, it is so hot, they die just of exposure to the flames as they're throwing them in. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. I honestly wonder what's going through their minds at this point. They seemed very confident God is going to deliver us, and perhaps they're sitting there trying to figure out when that deliverance is going to come. Maybe the king's going to change his mind. He says, oh, that's great, you honor your God, that's fine, I respect that. Okay, well, he didn't respect that, now he's super mad, and maybe something's going to happen to the furnace, or maybe it's going to start raining, or maybe the guards are going to trip, or maybe angels are going to come down at any moment and deliver us up until the moment they're in midair and they're falling into the fire. I wonder if they hit a point of acceptance, saying, this is how it will be. And then this happens. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. You see, God was making a statement here. To Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, God is saying, I am with you wherever you are. I am not just with you and you trying not to defile yourselves with the food. I'm not just with you and giving you favor in the eyes of the king. I'm not just with you in your position of power. I'm with you in the fire. I'm going to meet you there. I'm with you past the moment you feel all is lost. Now, to the king, who had just said, who could possibly save you? God responds with kind of raising his hand, flexing his arms and showing Nebuchadnezzar, I am more powerful than you can imagine. To the Jews in exile who read this, God says, I am with you in your exile. And you may feel as though you are in a furnace with no way out and no hope for the future, but I promise to walk with you through this time. To you today, God is saying there is no fire this world can create that can separate you from my love and my mercy and my power. Let me ask you, would this have been as spectacular if the furnace broke right before they could be thrown in? If they get it like really, really hot and the whole thing just collapses in on itself, like, oh man, maybe we'll try tomorrow, and then tomorrow the king changes his mind. Would you today know the names of those three young men? Would that have declared the power of God in the same way? You see, I want you to be praying that God's power would be shown through your life. But I want you to understand what that might mean. It's a flipping of our priorities. Instead of praying, first and foremost, God, take me out of all of my struggles. God, preserve me from all pain. If we begin saying, God, through every struggle that I trust you, that you choose to allow into my life, I want you to be made awesome through that. I want people to see what you can do in my life through that. I want people to know that there's nothing other than the living and true God that could get me through this and produce in me what I know you're going to do. I know that this might happen through suffering. And again, I'll just give you an example. This past week, as I was counseling with these students, I was reminded that God provided an open door to me, in part because I could tell them I've been there when I felt like life wasn't worth living anymore. I've been there when I saw no way out and no hope on the horizon, and I can tell you that it gets better. Because God brought me through that. And so I'm thankful for the trials. I don't enjoy them. I don't look forward to them. I don't wake up in the morning, oh God, he's suffering today. But I'm thankful for them. I'm thankful for the result that is produced in my life through them. And so these three men, they're pulled out. I gotta wonder if they had to coax them out. I'll be honest. If I was like in the middle of a fire, like an unharmed, and like either God in the flesh or an angel's in there walking with me, I'm not going to be in a hurry to get out of there. I mean, this is kind of cool. Like, we're just going to hang out here for a little while. Come back in half an hour. Please come out. And they come out, and the hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. God demonstrated his complete mastery over this raging furnace that they couldn't control. Now hear me in this. The same would have been true if they had died in the fire. They would have come through on the other side entirely unharmed in the presence of God forever and ever. So you understand that God's power will be declared on that final day when all of us, I promise you, all of us in Christ are going to make it through this. And in response, then, the king makes a declaration saying that nobody can speak against the God of the Israelites. No other God can deliver like he can. And he's not converted. He doesn't begin worshiping that God and only that God, but he is forced to acknowledge the power of God. And I've seen that. I've been around people who are like, even though I don't believe in your God, I cannot deny what I've seen him do. In Daniel 3:30, then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon, and that is the last that we hear of them. The rest of the book follows Daniel and his struggles. Now, sometimes, we read this and we say, well, that's great for them, Because, my clothes are definitely on fire right now. That's great for them that there's an angel walking with them, but that hasn't happened with me. Or I don't know that that's going to happen in my case. And I want you to understand, this isn't like one of those Hollywood endings, right, where they live happily ever after. Remember, they're still serving an empire that hates everything that they stand for. They're still slaves. They didn't get to go back home. It's 70 years of captivity. In all likelihood, they died without ever again getting to see their homeland. So there's this unfulfilled anticipation. Many of those Jews who were faithful to God in Babylon died before they were ever able to return. But let me tell you, they were waiting for more than their native country. Book of Hebrews in chapter 11, many people call it the faith chapter, and it describes these people who are faithful to God. And then it goes and it says this: these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. So these people, they were completely faithful to God. In all circumstances, and that's definitely what Hebrews 11 is about. In all circumstances, and yet even then, the completeness of what God had promised them was not something that they got to taste during their life. And so they greeted God's promises as something far off and not yet. Many of those promises we are living in today. I hope you understand that